Good evening, and welcome to Young Professionals in Foreign Policy's livestream on missile defense, the dawn of the hypersonic missile. I am Geoffrey Hoevenagel. Over 31 countries have ballistic missiles, and the proliferation of these is a key global security concern, as we are currently in a world without the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which changed the strategic environment significantly. Missile defense has undergone an immense transformation since the 1980s from the Strategic Defense Initiative, aimed at defending from uncountable number of missiles, to dealing with a handful of missiles from rogue states, while the threat environment is still constantly evolving. We face numerous other challenges, such as an expanding battle space and an era of declining defense budgets. Budget constraints challenges growth and modernization. Importantly, we see that competitors are building conventional and asymmetric capabilities such as unmanned aircraft vehicles and systems. Ballistic missiles are becoming more complex and advanced. There are missiles in various different ranges, such as intercontinental ballistic missiles, intermediate range ballistic missiles, medium range ballistic missiles, and short range ballistic missiles. More worrying is that there is close range ballistic missile with a range from 50 kilometers to 300 kilometers, in comparison to a short range ballistic missile, which has the range of 300 to 1,000 kilometers. More than ever is there a need for layered ballistic missile defense to provide maximum coverage to nations and their citizens, as well as military deployments from potential attacks as an integral part of our collective security. A missile defense system is highly complex and an integrated systems of systems, which includes components such as intelligence, early warning, tracking, and interception at the different phases of their trajectories, including a highly responsive command and control system. These complexities bring numerous challenges, such as interoperability and the integration of weapons systems. To simply put, a defensive system that is not intended to threaten other states, but to negate the threat of ballistic missiles. The hypersonic missile is not necessarily something novel. It has been in development for decades. However, the technological past years has built a lot of media hype. The hypersonic missile presents a significant challenge to develop countermeasures, such as detection and interception. These missiles can travel over 5 times the speed of sound, Mach 5, while some reportedly can go over Mach 20 with high maneuverability and accuracy over long ranges. They're challenging to detect and track because they travel in the higher atmosphere with an unpredictable ballistic trajectory. The US Defense Intelligence Agency in March 2018 stated, developments in hypersonic propulsion will revolutionize warfare by providing the ability to strike targets more quickly at greater distances and with greater firepower. Before we start, I would like to thank NATO for supporting YPFP for making this event possible. To explore this topic, I have the great pleasure to welcome the following speakers. Gordon Skip Davis Jr. is the NATO's Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment Division. He previously served as Director of Operations and in Stuttgart, Germany, Commander Combined Security Transition Command, Afghanistan in Kabul, as Director of Operations and Intelligence, SHAPE in Mons, before retiring from the US Army as a Major General. Skip's professional life has been characterized by operational and institutional military assignments interspersed with study and practice of international affairs and defense issues, primarily in Europe. Most of Skip's career has been dedicated to NATO and the European defense, including numerous assignments and operations with the US, NATO, and UN forces in Europe, Africa, Middle East, and Central Asia. Skip brings an unusual depth of practical experience and conceptual understanding of contemporary and emerging defense issues, as well as executive level experience in operations, intelligence, leader development, capability development, and policy development. Skip holds an undergraduate degree in nuclear physics and graduate degrees in international military history and strategic studies. Melanie Marlowe is a senior associate non-resident Center for Strategic and International Studies. She writes on American politics with a special focus on the presidency and the Constitution. She edited with Carol McNamara the Obama presidency in the constitutional order and contributed chapters on President Obama's exercise of general constitutional powers and his view of his commander-in-chief powers to that volume. In addition to other publications on the Obama presidency, specifically, she has published on the executive roles in the administrative state and is co-editing a volume on national security law and policy. A native of Idaho, she received a bachelor's degree in political science from Utah State University and a master's from Claremont Graduate University, where she is completing a dissertation on executive war powers. She's currently a lecturer at Georgetown University, where she teaches national security law, a senior editor at War on the Rocks, co-host of Net Assessment Podcast, and principal of M3 Consulting. Melanie and Skip, thank you for taking your time to be here, and welcome to Young Professionals in Foreign Policy. Before I give the floor to the speakers, I would like to make an announcement to everyone watching this live stream. Please put your question on the comment section. And I do also want to stress speakers have the right to pass on a question. Skip, let's start with you. Could you please provide us your insight into NATO's work in missile defense? The floor is yours.
First off, Jeffrey, thank you for you a shorter bio next time, so you don't have to go through the pain of reading all those words. But that was very generous, and I also want to thank you for the kind invitation to speak to young professionals in foreign policy tonight. Let me first off say happy Thanksgiving to all the Americans in the audience, and Melody, my co-speaker for tonight. I want to just wish you a great day. If you haven't had a day already, if you're in Europe, and hopefully you're still enjoying a early afternoon, and hopefully you have an evening still to go. It's a real pleasure to join you today, and it's a welcome opportunity to address an audience given your current roles and interest, but more importantly, what I would say is your potential for future positions in the private or public sector, in policy and or service in government or international organizations. And so that's really my interest in to kind of convey what I would like to cover, which is an overview of NATO's integrated air and missile defense policy and capability development. Now, I'm going to refer to integrated air and missile defense as IAMD from this point forward, so that I can save a few words on each part of my discussion. So let me talk a little about the historical background first, along with the current context and a bit of the way forward for the future. So first off, big picture, just like other policies and capability areas in NATO, IAMD can be a challenge. It can be a challenge just to arrive at consensus, so to speak, but also a challenge in terms of the multiplicity of threats that have to be addressed. But it's a challenge worth facing, and more importantly, for those of the doubters of the consensus world, it's not insurmountable. Deterrence and defense requirements, concepts, plans, posture are all a function of several factors. An ever-evolving security environment, which is kind of a main focus for tonight's discussion, but also past experiences and policies, which is why history is important to think about. Both, of course, existing and programmed capabilities, emerging technologies, we're going to talk about hypersonics tonight, but also public perception and, very important, political will and ambition, which then leads to investment priorities and more. Now, NATO is an alliance of 30 nations, and many people, certainly in the U.S., seem to think, "Oh, that's incredible." Okay, well, think about 50 states coming together for government policy in the United States. And I would tell you, it's a sight bit easier, I think, at times to achieve consensus amongst 30 nations within NATO. But NATO approaches issues both from a collective view, but also respecting the prerogative of individual nations. And certainly those nations that are part of other international organizations, like a regional organization like the European Union, which has plenty of policies, regulatory authorities, etc. Now, each of the factors I mentioned above apply for each nation individually and collectively as an alliance. And furthermore, in the context of an alliance, you have to factor in the need for a shared assessment, a shared or common defense planning process, other common policies, common doctrine, interoperable capabilities, common standards that can be procedural and technical, multinational cooperation, and ideally, unity of command. All those things go into a significant, comprehensive, complex capability like IMD. And additionally, you've got to take into account a range of political sensitivities, competing national priorities, and in the case of the European Union member states, EU decisions and priorities. So a lot of factors there. But nonetheless, NATO has been dealing with those issues for 70 years and has accumulated a certain amount of knowledge, expertise, and experience, in achieving consensus, and has a whole series of procedures and structures and frameworks that allow arriving at consensus, despite those different national views, by sharing information and focusing on common objectives. The second point is that changes in policy and capability requirements at the strategic level don't occur rapidly. It takes time to confirm the need for changes in strategic direction, to analyze options, consolidate positions, and achieve consensus. But given that, positive change does occur. It might not be at lightning speed, but it occurs primarily, as I said before, because of common values, common purpose, agreed principles for action and cooperation that allies share. And now IMB is arguably one of the policy and capability areas that's has been most impacted by changes in the security environment over the last 6 years. We've seen recent developments, obviously in Russia, but further abroad in Europe, as well as in Syria, Iraq, Iran, and in North Korea. And IMD continues to be of great relevance and interest to the allies. So there's two takeaways I'm going to talk about up front, and I'll come back to at the end. First is that most of the political and planning conditions are now set within the alliance to achieve greater progress and accelerate progress in alliance IMD capabilities, readiness, and posture. And second, the alliance at the political and military levels is focused on both addressing new and emerging threats at the same time as leveraging the opportunities new applications of technology or new technologies offer to retain a technological edge vis-a-vis potential adversaries, challengers, competitors. So let me start off with historical context. And this is important for policymakers today. You've got to understand where we're coming from, especially when you're dealing with nations that have long memories, maybe not Chinese long memories in terms of centuries, but we're certainly in terms of decades, and therefore base policy change on where we're starting from. So a few things to understand the kind of the road we've traveled. First off, the first steps of NATO IMD were taken in the 1960s. So I think for most of the audience, that might be when your parents were kids, okay? But nonetheless, nations were participating in the first common NATO military structure, and they realized that they needed individual, they needed a collection of air defense systems that brought together these individual operating systems to effectively protect the alliance on a broad front against air-delivered threats from the Warsaw Pact, which was obviously the threat of the day. Therefore, they began working together to establish a structure to overcome this deficiency, combining national assets, and then select NATO, I would say, backbone types of elements to establish an integrated air defense structure and system. And NATO called it the Integrated Air Defense System. We love acronyms. So back then it was called the NATONADS, okay? Not an easy one off the tongue, but nonetheless a little bit quicker than NATO Integrated Air Defense System. So integration is not a new theme. It's an enduring central theme for NATO. It's how NATO, represents a greater whole than just the sum of its parts. NATONADS, formed the air defense backbone during throughout the Cold War, and then post-Cold War, NATONADS evolved to account for the threat that was proposed by tactical ballistic missiles and deployed operations. So in the 1990s, some of you might remember, we had offensive operations that was conventional counterforce. We called it scud hunting in the 1990-1991 Gulf War. That became part of the kind of deployed aspect of NATONADS. And then the operations the alliance conducted over the following, I'd say, 3 decades. Think of the Balkans, initially Afghanistan, Iraq, then Libya later on, and of course continued efforts in Afghanistan and Iraq, have demonstrated that the conventional air threat of the Cold War was limited, if not non-existent, and could be handled, frankly, by airborne air defense, which means you could potentially gain an efficiency by focusing more on the air aspect of air defense versus the land or surface-based air defense. Of course, during this initial period, old adversaries became partners. Some became part of the alliance, and there was really no longer an air and missile defense threat that was considered serious from the east. Now, a casualty, as I said, was that surface-based air defense. But air policing grew to become a significant aspect over time, which is really focused on unidentified air threats and ensuring that allies with air forces could cover the airspace and maritime waters of those allies that did not have air capabilities. Now, while the threat from the east subsided, the ballistic missile and nuclear programs of Iran and North Korea served as a driving force behind the development of national missile defense programs, specifically in the United States. And then concurrently, unmanned aerial systems became more and more sophisticated and prolific, ranging from the high altitude multi-sensor systems, which the U.S. is famous for. And we now have 5, by the way, in NATO. We're very proud of that. The Alliance ground surveillance system, a bunch of RQ-4s with key centers, as well as a whole series. We've got 5 different categories of unmanned aerial systems down to what we call the low, slow, small, and cheap, type. Now, the U.S. missile defense program developed along several strands, but most importantly, the one that was relevant to NATO was an offer of capability to the alliance underneath the title of European Phased Adapted Approach, which became and remains the operational backbone of NATO ballistic missile defense. And over several summits, mostly through the first decade plus of the 2000s, NATO ballistic missile defense retained a central political focus. No one really talked about air defense, and even lower level missile defense kind of disappeared from the political agenda. The most commonly voiced concern was the potential future threat from Iran. And the main political challenge was understanding that the implications of a 24/7 strategic missile defense system in the heart of Europe. Hold on, let me just go back just a second. The main political challenge was understanding that having a 24/7 strategic missile defense system in the heart of Europe had a significant impact on the perceptions of Russia of NATO as a partner versus a potential threat, and potential to influence its aspects of or views on nuclear strategic stability. So much of the political focus was on how to exercise control over the NATO capability that it needed to protect itself from Iran, while addressing Russia's concern in reaction to NATO ballistic missile defense capability and policy. And in 2010, the Lisbon summit, allies agreed to address air missile defense in a more holistic way, adding the missile there into NATO integrated air and missile defense system. NATONADS became NATONAMS, okay, and the new ballistic missile defense elements were added to NATONADS. A common funded program was established for the command, control, communications, intelligence aspect of ballistic missile defense, and then also policy to encourage nations to contribute to ballistic missile defense in addition to just the U.S. And despite Russia's opposition to this initiative, NATO continued to maintain a generally overall positive relationship with Russia. Policy assumptions were that alliance would continue to operate in a non-contested air situation. Main potential threats were posed by ballistic missile defense programs from Iran, North Korea, and Russia should be reassured, and for some time would eventually agree to some level of cooperation with NATO on ballistic missile defense. Now, the Syrian war in the autumn of 2012 and the Assad's regime's increased use of ballistic missiles changed some Allied perceptions on where the threat might come from BMD, and then later the employment and proliferation of UAVs, both ISIS terrorist groups and opposition groups, as well as by the coalition that formed between Syria, Russia, Iran support, etc., began to concern allies and led to a specific support to Turkey in order to protect their national air defense with NATO contributions. Meanwhile, NATO's relationship with Russia started degrading. I think many of you will recall certainly references to a 2007 speech in Munich. Everyone in the in the U.S. and Europe that was in policy development at that time recalls that as a watershed moment. And then immediately after the conflict in Russia, in Georgia, and Russia's efforts there, and frankly insufficient European reaction to that led to a number of concerns. There wasn't a U.S. effort to reset relations. That was also, kind of adopted as well in Europe, assuming that okay, we can get over this little tiff, so to speak, between Russia and the West. And also, I should say that what happened, despite that desire for reset, Russia leaders decided to single out NATO's new BMD capabilities as their most contested issue in dealing with NATO, and so raised the bar a bit in terms of trying to prove that our capabilities that we're developing, first deployed forward naval ships, then the establishment of the Romanian Agents Ashore site, and then plans for the Polish, which is underway and nearing completion. All of that continued to exacerbate Russian views of NATO intent. But the big game changer occurred in March of 2014 when Russia illegally occupied Crimea. Later on, throughout the spring and summer, both supporting and then being involved in directly conflict in eastern Ukraine, etc. And it was clear by words and deeds that NATO now faced a potential peer adversary with significant air and missile capabilities and the demonstrated will to deploy them. Now, over the last 6 years, NATO's taken stock of the wide-ranging developments, both in terms of potential and real air missile threats, the continued modernization of Russian air, missile, and air defense capabilities, and I would include, dual capable delivery systems, dual capable both conventional and nuclear, but also unmanned aerial systems, and an integration of those capabilities for a targeting sensor to C2 to shooter system that had not been demonstrated before. And then, of course, the development, testing, and fielding of the INF violating missile that Jeffrey referenced early on, but also the employment and improvement of the caliber-capable missile system on maritime and land, configurations, but maritime platforms, and then, of course, deploying that across not just the Northern and Baltic fleet, but now all across the Baltic fleet, and then now a permanent presence, subsurface and surface platforms in the Mediterranean. And then, of course, employment of air, missile, and air defense assets abroad into Syria, primarily, and of course, maritime assets I was talking about just a second ago, and then finally UAS as well. And of course, I talked about Syria and Eastern Mediterranean, but frankly, we also have to consider those systems that are operating in Eastern Ukraine right now as well. And then, of course, Iranian deployment of missiles, rockets, and UAS in Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. Of course, I think most of us are tracking the most recent complex employment of unmanned aerial systems in the attack on oil fields in Saudi Arabia. And then most recently, we've also noted the announcement of and seen, I say, evidence of Russia's development and testing of new categories of weapon systems. Okay, this is the Wunder, weapons of 2018's announcement, which included a new intercontinental nuclear-powered cruise missile, included a long-range nuclear torpedo, and of course a hypersonic system as well. And so, while it's key to ensure that our defense and deterrence posture is applied to factor these new challenges and that the posture remains effective, it's also important that we need to respond in a balanced and measured way. We don't necessarily need to mirror what Russia does. So they're looking for asymmetric, I'd say, solutions to some of the challenges they see from NATO capabilities. And so we also need to think along those same lines. We're not necessarily trying to come up with a one-for-one the parity, but looking for what are those types of solutions that allow us to make those solutions ineffective, or those Russian solutions ineffective, or make them cost prohibitive. And so that's what we're kind of working on. So on moving to policy development, kind of recent progress and the way ahead. We recently revised our NATO IMD policy, which had taken into account the old strategic concept from 2010, which is still valid today. There's talk about potentially revising that sometime in the future, near future. A recent joint air power strategy in 2018, and then political guidance that was provided for national defense or NATO defense planning in 2019. All of those had impacts on IMD policy. And the revised policy provides guidance to the NATO military authorities, that's the committee and the strategic commands for the development of military requirements and underlying conceptual and operational documents that are related to IMD. At the national level, IMD can have let me just talk a little quickly about the doctrine so we're straight on this, can have different connotations for national concepts and doctrine, but accepted NATO IMD policy is about all those measures that contribute to deter any air or missile threat or nullify or reduce their effectiveness in order to protect populations, territory, and forces. And that's against the full spectrum of air missile threats. In other words, IMD is considered a defensive concept. It's a defensive part of joint air power, and it's how NATO fights adversary air capabilities such as aircraft, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, rockets, mortars, artillery, and UAS. And it is inherently multi-layered, but also includes air surveillance, includes air C2, active and passive air missile defense capabilities, and incorporates surface-based and airborne assets. Now, IMD is doctrinally what the U.S. would call defensive counter-air. Offensive counter-air, which includes deep precision strike, it's kind of like those offensive things you can do to prevent the archer from shooting in the first place, so to speak. That's still part of NATO's toolkit. It's not necessarily part of IMD. We put it in the joint air power category, just so we know in terms of doctrinal terms. Now, in addition to the revised IMD policy, NATO is just completing a revised standing defense plan, which is focused on transition from NATO IMD in peacetime, through enhanced readiness to crisis or conflict, and has also developed a number of other political military estimates that are relevant to IMD threats and responses. Okay, and there's a whole series of strategic tasks that are ongoing right now. There are other strategic work strands as well that aren't directly related to IMD, but impact IMD. And these include the approval of an overarching space policy last year and a plan to implement space as an operational domain for NATO. And for those that are very familiar with what space provides obviously kind of that permanent eye, or at least frequent eye, for early warning, and then of course tracking and then guidance for missile systems, as well as communications, for all sorts of that sensor, C2, and then effector system for IMD. And NATO also is working on emerging and disruptive technology. We've completed a roadmap, working on an implementation strategy. We've identified 7 different areas, many of which are directly relevant to IMD now and into the future, both near and kind of midterm future. The things, obviously, artificial intelligence, big data, autonomy, those are all parts of existing capabilities but can be improved and are part of this focus. But also hypersonic weapon systems, improved sensors, and then, of course, quantum technologies eventually off kind of in the horizon. So all those things are being looked at in terms of both challenges and then opportunities that we can use to adopt them and integrate them faster into our defense capabilities. That's defensive and offensive capabilities in the larger sense. Now, in parallel to the strategic policy efforts, the military authorities have got a new NATO military strategy that was adopted in 2019. And then in June of this year, a framework for the deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area, long title, but essentially means now an overarching concept on deterrence defense objectives and employment of the military instance of power and a comprehensive view of the threats in a 360-degree approach. We didn't have that. We needed that in order to develop what's coming next is more of a strategic, comprehensive defense plan for all types of challenges we can see right now and into the very near future. And then what's called a NATO warfighting capstone concept being completed now. It's going to be delivered in a week or two, and then it'll be adopted through a series of military considerations and political military considerations in the first quarter of next year. That looks out 20 years and looks at trajectories in fighting, both the threats and challenges, major mega trends that can impact on the military environment and the military instrument of power, and then how we need to move from where we are now to be able to protect our territory, forces, and citizens 20 years from now. And those are key in terms of leading capability development, which is my last and shortest part of the discussion. So where are we right now in terms of IMD? We start with ballistic missile defense. We are in phase 3 of this European adapted phased approach I talked about before. We've got a functioning Aegis ashore in Romania. We're completing construction of one in Poland. It planned to be certified and delivered and then transferred from the U.S. to NATO sometime in 21. And so that's soon. We are starting to receive upgrades on our Aegis afloat, our Aegis destroyers. 4 have been deployed for now 8 years in Europe, but they're getting new capabilities. And some of you may be tracking the new SM-3 Block 2 Alpha, what that can do. Extremely important increments of range and sensitivity and precision. And then more nations are investing in ballistic missile defense. A number of new nations, Poland, Romania, and then a partner, Sweden, are all buying Patriots. The Dutch and Danes are investing in capable missile defense cruisers. And so those are important. And finally, more and more allies are receiving their F-35s, which we've now understand is a multi-role platform. It's not just it's not just something delivering effects. It's a sensor. It's a fusion, intelligence fusion platform. It can be a C2 platform, and then of course an effector. So that's all key. And so the last thing I want to say is that alliance capabilities are kind of developed over a 4-year defense planning process. I talked about political guidance in 2019. In 2020, this year, we agreed on the military capability requirements to achieve the level of ambition in that planning guidance, and that identified a whole series of integrated air missile defense capabilities that needed to be added to the current inventory. Okay, we're now in the 3rd year and apportioning those requirements across nations, and we will complete that process next year, where nations sign up to deliver all the various aspects of the military requirements. And then in the 4th year, that's really where we're assessing where we are, and we need to make changes. We actually do it every 2 years. So it's every the 2nd and 4th year of our cycle, we're focused on assessments. We've just finished that assessment in 2020, and no surprise, there's some additional requirements in IMD that we expect to be added to our requirements, and we have adjusted our planning priorities accordingly. Finally, what I would say is in all of that, we've seen a significant increase in IMD requirements compared to previous planning cycles, certainly compared to the one that we completed in 2018. And of course, we know more about what's going on in terms of development and testing and fielding of technologies in Russia. And then it's not a threat, direct threat to the alliance, but they are an exporter, and they are certainly a threat to regional partners in the Asia Pacific. And so we're seeing a more aggressive China, and so we're concerned about the technology and certainly our partnership with others on that technology. And then finally, what I wanted to share is that in terms of capability requirements, we have focused heavily on multinational cooperation opportunities, because many nations that are smaller don't have the industrial base and don't have the size of defense spending programs to basically buy large systems like THAAD, Patriot, et cetera, or even SAM-T. So, but they can achieve scale by working together. And so we started a initiative called Enabling Multinational Cooperation in the Conference of National Armament Directorates, or EMC2, for those scientists out there and nuclear physics background, like the E equals MC squared. But I mean, that the EMC2 is a nice little acronym for us. And so with that first pilot case, we focused on ground-based air defense. We came up with 7 different cooperation areas. That's led to 2 major projects right now, one on modular ground-based air defense from very short to medium range with a common C2 background, as well as counter rocket air and mortar systems. And then we're now working on a C2 layer of integrating, command systems from legacy, current, and maybe even future systems, so that we can have the architecture for greater integration and obviously interoperability. And then we're looking at other project areas that haven't yet come to a declaration of intent or memorandum of understanding, but are looking long range at optimized sensors for low altitude as well as long range effectors. Those are on the horizon. So the bottom line is lots of activity, and certainly in the armaments community, we're doing that closely with the science and technology community. Lots of activities focused on IMD challenges and other challenges that we're going to have spin-offs that will support our IMD effects or IMD capabilities. And so at the end, I'll wrap up 2 takeaways again to start off with. The first is that most of the political and even programmatic conditions are set now for achieving greater capabilities and even accelerating delivery of those capabilities in respect to IMD. And then the alliance at both the political and military levels are focused on addressing new and emerging threats at the same time as leveraging the opportunities that the new applications of technology or new technology offer to retain NATO's technological edge. So I'll stop there. I've covered a lot and quickly, and I apologize for my fast delivery, but hopefully it's provided the kind of content to see what we're doing to retain our technological edge and protect our alliance citizens, forces, and territory. And with that, I hand the floor back to Jeffrey. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that great presentation. And we will, of course, follow up with a Melanie, you have discussed in the past about a lot of policy issues and importantly about the budget, especially for supporting to having more budget for the defensive measures against hypersonic missiles. Could you tell us more about that with your presentation? The floor is yours.
I liked Skip's presentation. It was very optimistic there at the end, and I enjoy that. And it's very nice to speak to you in Brussels. In 2018 and 2019, I was able to go to Brussels and speak with people at NATO, and I really look forward to the time that I can do that again. So I am grateful to have this opportunity to talk to you about hypersonic weapons. I'm going to be focusing on hypersonic strike and defense issues. And these affect not just the United States, but of course, as Skip has discussed, how they affect NATO and our transatlantic alliance. So today I'd like to talk about 3 big issues: missile defense, space, and time-sensitive targeting. And Skip actually touched on a couple of these things. So hypersonic strike and defense lie squarely at this intersection. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a military planner. I don't have 37 years in the Army, but I do look at things from the policy's perspective, and more specifically, the perspective of American policy. So I will be focusing on the efforts the United States is making in the areas of hypersonic strike and defense, as well as some of the obstacles that it faces. I'll say a few words about how these capabilities are important to meeting the security challenges facing the transatlantic alliance today. And finally, I'll talk about where the incoming Biden administration might be headed on these issues, and then any other questions or ideas that you guys or thoughts you might have on the incoming administration. So hypersonics is one of the fastest growing defense issues these days, both for what our adversaries are developing and for investments on the part of the United States and our allies. The reemergence and diffusion of hypersonic strike capability raises important questions about precision strike and long-range standoff relative to our broad deterrence and defense goals, as well as for the goals and institutions of the missile defense enterprise. Regardless of whether we're talking about hypersonics, supersonics, or good old-fashioned subsonics, the discussion has to begin with the strategic, threat, and policy context. The possibility of aerodynamic hypersonic systems has been around since the 1960s, but at that time, the sturdy old ballistic missiles seemed good enough bang for the buck. The space shuttle was a hypersonic glider, but interest in weaponization of the technology was delayed. Discussion of the hypersonics sparked a bit in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, but the United States was too busy enjoying our unipolar moment for it to have much urgency. We convinced ourselves that Russia and China were not threats, and then we got busy with counterterrorism. Novel forms of conventional prompt strike were not prioritized by the United States. Russia and China, however, saw this period differently, and they exploited our geopolitical preoccupations to get ahead on hypersonic development. And then, as Skip mentioned, around 2014, we realized that history had returned. The 2018 American National Defense Strategy calls the central challenge of our time the renewed long-term competition with Russia and China. Russia's invasion of Ukraine confirmed that something had changed. Their invasion of Georgia was not a one-off. Meanwhile, the Chinese were making and continue to make all manner of mischief in the South China Sea, and they are pushing around their neighbors in various ways. The Obama administration took note of this at the tail end of their time in office, but it was the 2018 National Defense Strategy that formalized what was gradually sinking in. And over the last 5 years or so, the United States has been moving out on hypersonic strike programs, as are a number of our adversaries and allies. So what this means for missile defense, given that we have had for so long been focused primarily on rogue ballistic state missiles, remains an open question. The 2019 Missile Defense Review warned that the scale and urgency of change required to address these problems should not be underestimated. Nevertheless, efforts to date for hypersonic defense have not met that scale and urgency. But before we get to the defense, let's talk a little bit more about strike. As everyone here knows, hypersonic literally just refers to speed. What goes under the heading of hypersonics includes at least 3 distinct types of missiles. First, there's the hypersonic glide vehicles. These might be launched on top of ballistic missile boosters and then deployed to fall and glide across the top of the atmosphere. A second category is a really fast cruise missile powered by scramjet. These never leave the atmosphere. They have different propulsion and trajectories, like the Russian Zircon missile. But there are other hypersonic systems as well, to include so-called aeroballistics or other maneuvering reentry vehicles. So the Russian Kinzhal or the Chinese DF-17 glider. To be sure, the United States has now begun to get into the hypersonic strike game as well. The 2021 presidential budget request had around $3.2 billion for various hypersonic strike programs. These include the DARPA Hawk and the Tactical Boost Glide program and OpFires, the Air Force's Arrow and their new program, HACM, the Army's LRHW, or the Long Range Hypersonic Weapon, and the Navy's Intermediate Range Conventional Prompt Strike. And the Department of Defense stood up the Joint Hypersonics Transition Office last year, which is meant to help accelerate hypersonic engineering efforts and work with industry and universities as their work progresses. And as far as universities go, to support these programs and new ones, the Department of Defense just awarded Texas A&M a 5-year, $100 million contract to develop and oversee a university consortium for applied hypersonics. 41 American institutions are listed to participate, and universities from Australia, Canada, the UK, and elsewhere are also expected to join. Notre Dame and Purdue are also heavily involved in hypersonic research and testing, and have been for a while. The unique nature of universities, where experts from many fields are present to work on problems in an interdisciplinary way with advanced testing facilities, puts high expectations on this project. Now, why is the United States, Russia, or China pursuing these things? Don't we have ballistic missiles or cruise missiles that can perform the strike job? To an extent, yes, but the proliferation of advanced air defenses among our adversaries as well as among our allies has complicated the ability of older strike systems to reliably penetrate hostile airspace, and thus the confidence that one has in the ability to hold targets at risk. China and Russia have been doing a lot of investment in air defenses. For example, we witnessed things like the Russian sale of the S-400 to Turkey, which has made things complicated for NATO. Today's Patriot, THAAD, and Aegis-based defenses protect U.S. and allied forces abroad, including carrier groups and ground forces, against aerial and ballistic missile attack. Designed to go around or under those defenses, and even to evade strategic warning, hypersonic strike is a new way to hold our forces at risk and thereby undermine our broader defense goals and our alliances. This is ultimately about the credibility of United States power projection and the ability of the United States to protect our allies and partners. These new hypersonic delivery systems could certainly be used to target the American homeland, but their more immediate application is probably regional. For example, Russia already targets NATO members with ballistic and cruise missiles launched from all types of platforms, drones for surveillance or to carry weapons, cyber technology, and other measures. Russia's point is to keep NATO from shoring up the Baltics, Poland, and Romania. So just as our adversaries are coming up with new ways to structure attacks and hold us at risk, so we are for them. These hypersonic strike programs are important to adapt our strike capabilities to the reality of renewed great power competition and to restoring the conventional overmatch. The investment made to date is a measure of the seriousness of the realignment. So to reiterate the point, hypersonic strike is not a redundant capability. The combination of maneuverability, speed, and unpredictable trajectory is qualitatively better than the legacy ballistic or cruise missile capability, or for that matter, munitions dropped from fixed-wing platforms. Because this combination of characteristics is such a qualitative improvement, we should not expect the demand signal to be going away anytime soon. Every single day, we want China and Russia waking up and thinking that today is not a good day to pick a fight with the United States or its allies. And there is a reason that hypersonic strike is part of realizing United States and allied broad defense goals. So now let's move to the defense side of the house, to countering and defending against the threat of hypersonic attacks. While the strike programs have clearly defined paths forward, this area remains a bit less established, as Jeffrey mentioned, and this greatly concerns me. The best approach here is a balanced one, a mix of offense and defense. Hypersonic defense is a hard problem, but it's not an impossible one. Just as there are no silver bullets, so too no defense is perfect. And as with other forms of air and missile defense, even a limited defense can have strategic effect by complicating an adversary's calculus and by buying time for the United States and combined forces to respond. Countering, as opposed to defending, will be an important part of this equation, part of which is passive defense. If military forces are more mobile, dispersed, and their location is less certain, then that does decrease the likelihood that an enemy can find, fix, track, and target them successfully. But active defense must also be a part of a comprehensive approach. Although the National Defense Strategy endorses more dispersed and smaller basing constructs, there are limitations to this. You cannot hide Guam, and one cannot move or completely disguise an airfield or some other big facility. Even limited defenses will help complicate our adversary's calculus, improve our freedom of maneuver, and shore up our broad deterrence and defense goals. They will reduce opportunities for the adversary to intimidate or coerce our allies. The more quickly the United States can field this technology and integrate it into a comprehensive missile defense structure, the better we can protect American carriers, forward bases, and allies through both deterrence and defense. Now, hypersonic defense is a complex form of air defense, and in air defense, as in ballistic missile defense, the fundamentals of solving this problem come down to detect, control, and engage. And this commonality leads us to how and what programs must be adapted to contend with hypersonic threats. Hypersonic defense is not going to be done in a new stovepipe all its own, but rather in connection to how we've been contending with other threats. The United States Missile Defense Agency was stood up to build and maintain what has been known as the Ballistic Missile Defense System, the BMDS. But of course, we're now not just talking about ballistic missiles anymore. And because of that, the BMDS is renamed as the Missile Defense System, or just simple MDS. That change reflects how the agency is coming to grips with the complexity of this new challenge and how existing elements of the BMDS will need to be adapted. MDA is now pursuing hypersonic defense with the Aegis Maritime Solution. When the United States builds and deploys hypersonic defense interceptors, they will probably be deployed on ships and be controlled by the Aegis Combat System, as Skip mentioned. The President's budget request for hypersonic defense for fiscal year 2021 was a paltry $206 million. Although the Senate Appropriations Committee, the Defense Subcommittee, increased that to $272 million, so we aren't sure, it's still just not enough. When we go back to the fundamentals, detect, control, and engage, we see that adapting the missile defense system to deal with the hypersonic threat challenge will involve a lot of attention, and that is attention to sensors, shooters, and command and control. Of all the parts of a defense, nothing matters if we cannot see the threats in the first place. The sensor conversation is the central question, and not just for the desirability of intercepting them. Tracking these threats is important for strategic warning, even if we do not have the means to intercept them. It was strategic warning that allowed US troops to seek shelter in the Iranian missile attack on Al-Assad Air Base in January, where there were no Patriots available. We want as much time as possible to respond to an incoming attack. This reminds us of how important early warning is. No interceptor is better than the eyes that tell it where to go and what to kill. And there's no better vantage point than space from which to detect and track missiles in flight. The Hypersonic and Ballistic Tracking Satellite System, or HBTSS, has been a central piece of discussion for US missile defense efforts for both hypersonic and ballistic missiles. The new paradigm is for large numbers of smaller and cheaper satellites in low Earth orbit, what is called proliferated LEO. The need to go to space is fairly straightforward. Whether at sea or on land, surface-based sensors can't see over the horizon. That's been good enough for ballistic missiles, which have a predictable trajectory and which fly much higher. But for maneuvering threats and those that come in lower, you need elevated sensors to look down and track them throughout their flight, what's called birth-to-death tracking. And for that, there's just no better place than space. While progress is slowly being made in this area, a space sensor layer has been on the agenda for a long time without much action. Each of the last 6 administrations, Presidents Reagan through Trump, has been committed on paper to fielding a new space sensor layer, but none has actually done so. There's been some good progress made in the last couple of years, but it's now going to fall to the next administration to deploy them. Even just in January, Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Hyten, expressed frustration that we were unable to go very fast on this in research and testing. He said, "We've been doing studies since 2007. It's time to start throwing things up in the air, even if they aren't perfect on paper, and see what we can learn from the successes and the failures." Hypersonics also pose special challenges for command and control. Because these things can fly across multiple combatant commands, they can complicate the passing of sensor data, as well as cause confusion about who's supposed to shoot at it. The unpredictable nature of hypersonic trajectories means the data handoff between sensor systems must be seamless to allow them to look in the right places for threats. How can we rapidly capture, process, and act upon that data? The last 2 budget requests contain some modest improvements into the C2BMC, as well as upgrading various radars to report hypersonic tracks to the broader missile defense system. Since we don't have a space sensor layer yet, for now we're going to have to do the best we can to integrate existing elements to look for these kinds of threats. The general area, however, could be a place for integration of capabilities under development like artificial intelligence, automation, and machine learning to develop new algorithms to predict hypersonic missile maneuver. Finally, we have the engage part. This has also been a long time coming due to the relative deprioritization of the hypersonic defense broadly. Press accounts of the effectors part suggest that they are likely, at least at first, to be adaptations of today's interceptors, from Patriot to THAAD to Standard missiles. But in the longer term, more capable clean sheet interceptors will be needed. But we also need to be a bit more imaginative. The intercept solution might not be limited to hit to kill or even blast frag. There may be other ways to attack the adversary's hypersonic kill chain, limit their flexibility, and otherwise challenge the threat in ways that help us. Whereas directed energy has proven difficult for shielded reentry vehicles, it may have new applications here with non-kinetic means to weaken the airframe. So now let's move to NATO. Hypersonic missile threats from the likes of Russia are at the center of the military threats to NATO today. Hardly a national security speech goes by where Putin doesn't talk about his hypersonic delivery systems. But the United States is not going to be able to tackle this alone. There's a lot of science, technology, engineering, and logistical problems that we're going to be contending with as an alliance. Hypersonic strike testing, both on the ground and in wind tunnels and in the field, is going to require a lot of cooperation and better military exercises and simulations to think through how we protect critical nodes like Ramstein or our A-pods and S-pods is going to require different thinking. The 2018 Brussels summit issued a declaration on the need for NATO to look to the full suite of integrated air and missile defense, and that was certainly right. Cruise missile threats Like the INF treaty violating missile that Russia deployed is part of that aerial threat spectrum, but so are hypersonic threats. NATO's 2019 London Declaration said, "We are addressing the breadth and scale of new technologies to maintain our technological edge. China's and Russia's policies and actions, quote, present challenges that we need to address together as an alliance." I think the increase in contributions to NATO and spending in member countries in the last few years signals the seriousness with which we are taking all these current threats. We have Article 5. We have a collective security framework, but for that to be effective, when it matters, we will need to have in place sensors and interceptors and communications networks. We have to go forward together to meet these threats. So what might we see from a Biden administration? Well, President-elect Biden, as a senator, was not a big fan of missile defense. However, he's had a changed outlook on China, and many Obama administration officials who are coming back into the Biden administration, they thought that we could placate China and Russia. And I think that has fundamentally changed as they will take office in 2021. We expect Michelle Flournoy to be named the Secretary of Defense, although that's been held up for a little bit. But she's written quite a bit in the last 6 to 12 months and given quite a few speeches on what she thinks the priorities for a new Department of Defense should be. She recognizes that with the pressure of COVID and other problems, there will probably be basically flat budgets for the next few years. So she wants to place technology, focus on capability over capacity, and accelerate innovation to serve deterrence. She says we need better, not necessarily more. She did note in her Foreign Affairs article in June that we should be able to sink the Chinese Navy in 72 hours. So I think that's going to require a lot of missiles. But Eli Ratner, Jake Sullivan, the incoming National Security Advisor, Tony Blinken, the incoming Secretary of State, assuming confirmation, they, again, were not as forward perhaps on Russia and China as I think that they might be in this administration. So in conclusion, let me leave it here. Hypersonic threats are now an important part of the threat spectrum with which the United States and its allies will have to contend. We are making good progress on the strike side, but not so much on the defense side. It will need to be an offense-defense mix for hypersonic missiles, just as we have had with anti-ship cruise missiles and with ballistics. Pursuing both hypersonic strike and hypersonic defense in tandem will have mutually reinforcing effects. The more we understand the characteristics and the vulnerabilities of hypersonic vehicles, the better we can defeat them. And the more we can understand their weaknesses, the better our own strike forces can be improved for better penetration and survivability. And we are going to need investments in a comprehensive approach working together as an alliance. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation. We experiencing right now technical issues.
Why don't you ask a question?
Unfortunately, we are experiencing some technical issues with Skip, but we're trying to resolve that as quickly as possible. Let's start with you, Melanie. And I will, of course, you already talked about this in your presentation, but it would be a great way to set this tone focused on policy first. With the setback of INF, especially as considering that INF eliminated all land-based intermediate range nuclear missiles. How does what's your views on this? What do you see as the operating environment? Is it going to be is it pessimistic, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, in my view, it was the right thing to get out of the INF treaty. It was done perhaps abruptly. I would have liked to have seen more consultation with our allies and even with members of Congress at home. But Russia had clearly been violating that treaty for several years, even under the Obama administration. And while I very much understand that you don't want to just pick up your ball and go home, because there were important benefits that the United States and our allies gained under that, at a certain point, you have to recognize that you're going to be setting yourself quite far below your potential adversary, and you have to realize what the consequences of remaining in that treaty were. So my view is that there are opportunities perhaps for New START with the incoming administration. We are behind on a lot of the hypersonic development, and that is something that would concern me, putting us at a disadvantage in a treaty there, particularly China, which has not, seemed to want to be part of an arms control treaty. If they weren't in it, I'm not quite sure how the United States would be able to sign something.
Skip, I'll just repeat the question for you. With INF, especially considering that INF eliminated all land-based intermediate-range nuclear missiles, how is NATO's view? How does it currently see the operational and strategic environment? Is it worse? Are you pessimistic, perhaps, about the situation?
So first off, this wasn't something that occurred overnight. It's something that the alliance has been addressing for some time. In your lead off, you talked about my 3 previous assignments. Well, my 3rd previous assignment, when I was the Chief of Operations Intelligence from 2013 to 2015, I was briefing certainly the military committee, and at one time the NAC, specifically on this particular threat. So it's been around for at least 6 years in very high political discussions. And so the military planners and certainly defense planners have been incorporating that threat into their calculations, both in terms of capability requirements and concept development. And so I would say that it's not like it's suddenly changed anything. It's been part of the calculus for some time. It's been part of exercises, not yet completely at the NATO level, other than perhaps at command post level, but has been in the U.S. plus allies in terms of exercising against that threat. And so I think we feel fairly secure right now that we have certainly the counter-air options we need, and we have a significant amount of defensive capability, not all deployed at the right readiness where it needs to be. So advanced warning, great. We can put up the systems we need, but more importantly, we can also make sure that if it came to a significant fight, we could reinforce allies where needed, and we could defend against that threat. Because we're not talking about unlimited inventories here. We're talking about fairly small inventories, on the Russian side. So you have to take that into account as well. So the bottom line is it doesn't change the NATO's focus on defense. Certainly, it is a huge strategic concern because it's a violation of one of the fundamental treaties for nuclear stability and European defense, because that's what's focused on. But as you've heard in terms of the missile defense review and the nuclear posture review, and I actually contributed both, so I understand where the logic came from. That was already incorporated as part of the problem set to address in those reviews. And so the allies have accepted the U.S. logic to that, and they understand right now that, as I said before, we're not planning on a tit for tat. We're going to deploy intermediate range nuclear capability. We're going to have a strategic concept that includes offensive, defensive capabilities to offset that. And the U.S. specifically is thinking, in a broader sense of what it could bring to bear in case of a crisis. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you very much. Just keeping on to the policy issues, let's go start with Melanie. This was kind of fascinating when I started reviewing and reading up on this topic. During the Obama presidency, he limited a number of interceptors, especially in the mid-course system, from 30 when it initially had to be 44. He terminated some programs aimed at intercepting missiles. Overall, Obama had a key concern about missile defense of its potential destabilizing effects. Basically, hit a bullet with a bullet. And was focused on strategic patience. So Obama's strategic patience did not pay off, especially with North Korea. Would the president-elect Joe Biden follow the same course, or how do you see it in his presidency?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how he will handle this. Again, things have changed, and Michelle Flournoy has indicated, look, we're not going to denuclearize North Korea. This is going to be a matter of deterrence. And so I think that would be the perspective most of them are going to go into this with. From what I have seen, folks that have been publishing on this in the last couple of months and then heading into the administration. they would certainly like to work out some sort of a deal, but I'm not sure that they think that they're going to get, what Donald Trump was trying to get.
All right. Thank you very much. Let's start focusing on the core of missile defense and a few questions about NATO. But Melanie, you could always put your thoughts as well, as some of these are more broader questions. In regards to, especially with NATO and its allies, how can NATO help allies to further invest in missile defense capabilities? Because BMD policy specifies voluntary national contributions. And how do you start addressing the role of interoperability, Skip?
Okay, well then that's kind of daily fare for the division I'm in, and certainly the committees I support. So let me keep it cut rather broad. But I would say first off, that NATO defense planning process that I talked about before is where we basically achieve consensus on the requirements. First off, what is it we want to do? Or we want defense. We understand all these particular threats are out there. We want to be able to defend the alliance territories and forces, but also project power abroad necessary to respond to crises, to assist in crises in the periphery, cooperative security as well with the partners. So that lead we have, and the nations agree, to these capability targets, which address the threats that have been identified in the military capability requirements. So the planning process is exactly how NATO leads nations to invest in the things that are most important for the collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security core tasks of the alliance that everyone's agreed to. Now, they have to follow through with defense spending and the actually capability delivery of the capabilities, be they forces, be they weapon systems, be they other things. But that said, our defense planning assessment system, that 5-year cycle I told you about, is where nations are held accountable. They report on what they've done so far. There's a external eye, so to speak, on what they report, an analysis, and then an overarching report on, okay, here's where we've progressed to against our agreed commitments and agreed requirements. And then that leads to, okay, here's where we're short, here's where we need to then refocus our planning efforts on. And that's where we in the armaments community really focus our efforts. It's in those gap or vulnerability areas to make sure that we're coming up with the best possible solutions to those shortfalls. In some cases, just buying more of the same, but in most cases, it's not. It's trying to figure out new solutions, applications of capabilities. That's what the military folks work on primarily. But in our community, we're mostly looking at the material solutions and new applications of those solutions that can address our operational challenges. And so it's by showing them, showing that they haven't met what they need in one case, showing what they need to invest in, and then also helping them come up with the kinds of solutions at multinational groups of allies or collectively, and a few things that are kind of C4 ISR backbone pieces to integrating forces. And then I didn't talk about standards, but that's a big part of it as well, is ensuring we've got those material technical standards for ensuring compatibility, interoperability, and ideally integration of capabilities, as well as procedural standards for employing those capabilities.
Building on that, what challenges are anticipated, or what challenges does NATO experience when you're talking about integrating command and control systems of its allies, and how does NATO's air command and control system contribute to this?
Okay, and this is where I think that a lot of the things that Melody already addressed, and she did a great job. She said it wasn't technical, but I think she did a great job of going into some of the really hard problems that we're facing in delivering an effective defense capability against hypersonics specifically, and both active defense and counter air aspects, the strike aspects. And so in terms of the basic challenges are the fact that we've allowed a proliferation of systems that don't have a common digital backbone. They include proprietary solutions for command and control and for information, passage. And so a sensor has a specific, command and control link they can link to because maybe the same two consortia or same two, companies built those systems, but they're not interoperable by design. Even though that's a NATO principle, very few nations are focused on that. The smaller allies do so because they can't afford not to. The bigger allies, and the U.S. is one that unfortunately is the biggest violator, builds all sorts of systems, even within the same service, that can't talk to each other. And so our efforts over the last certainly 4 years have been focused, and I'll say U.S. side, put a U.S. hat on, have been figuring out how can we integrate these sensors and integrate the command and control system so that we can have a true sensor, C2, and a shooter or effector network. We're making progress. You've heard of integrated, battle command system that is kind of the Army's lead. There's the air battle command system from the Air Force. There's the cooperative engagement, systems for the Navy. There's the joint all domain operational or command and control that's meant to bring all these things together. So there's huge programs, service and joint, in the U.S. military. Allies have a smaller national aspect of that, but that's also what we're trying to build into our joint fires efforts. What I talked about, IEMD, our C2 layer, and the new modular GBAD with a common C2 structure. We're trying to solve those. The big picture thing is we have got to come up with our military, information operating system that allow us to add applications, some weapon systems, plug and play, so that we can all, connect. We have a bit of that in different areas like the Federated Mission Network, but we don't necessarily have that in the targeting system, joint fires, integrated air missile defense, and then all C4ISR. Integrating, ISR platforms is another huge issue in the U.S. At scale because of all of the various categories we've developed from a variety of companies that don't talk to each other. And so that's what's ongoing right now in the U.S. and then certainly in our S&T and armaments community to figure out how we can make these more integrated. And so huge challenge, making progress, figuring out how we can accelerate is our challenge right now.
Now it goes. I just wanted to jump back into what you guys discussed, both of you, in regards to the U.S. engagement in missile defense, especially within the European countries. The European phased adaptive approach, the EPAA, we've seen phase 2, we've seen phase 3 with airborne infrared Aegis BMD ships, but for this is just for to give more understanding for anyone who's not familiar with this. Why? But if you could indulge me to answer this, phase 4 cancelled in March 2013 because it seems an integral step forward. Skip or Melanie?
Okay, so I can only guess at phase 4 because when I came in, we only had to worry about phase 3. So that's when I really started focusing on it. I knew there was the possibility of another ground system, another agency source system in a country that I won't name right now, that was even more contentious to Russia. And I think it was considered when you did this specific overlay in what we call the defense design of your capabilities in the area, airspace and land territory or maritime space that you want to protect, you didn't need a third system. And so you could get it with 2 plus expected upgrades. And that's where, in fact, seeing those expected upgrades in terms of range and detection, and then let's see, it's called remote sensing, where one radar system, be it afloat, ashore, can cue and allow engagement of a target from a different radar system or tracking system. And so that allows us to expand the capabilities of existing systems, and I think that was the biggest reason. But I'm only operating on partial information there. So let me stop and see if Melody wants to add in.
At least as far as the beginning of your comments, that is my understanding as well. So.
Thanks. And so that does go into what I was just trying to explain, though, which is the this challenge we have. And we currently have all sorts of systems. You take it nationally or at the alliance level. If we brought together a bunch of air defense systems that are missile defense capable, from lower to upper layer, the vast majority were not built to be integrated, except to receive perhaps some fuse sensor information from an early warning system. But when it came down to actually tracking for the effector or the shooter, that was particularly directly connected to whichever radar system was supporting that, sensor system was supporting that target engagement radar for the effector. I didn't say that very well, but the bottom line is they weren't meant to be brought together and then fused so any sensor could guide any shooter. That's not how they were built. We're trying to backwards engineer that capability now to current systems, and then build new systems that have that type of integrated architecture as part of the design. So fix what we have, and then build future things to the defense design that we want to have, and real clusters of capability around things like airports, airfields, seaports, command and control, whatever it might be, centers that allow for broad area support from a small number of defense capable systems.
Thank you. We all know that threats are becoming more varied. We've got a question from the audience. However, that's going to be linked with this one. So we're going to split out the question in two parts. What can be the role of emerging technologies, such as directants? Melanie, Skip.
Melanie, want to start? Then I can tell you what we're doing right now.
I'm just going to tell you that I'm not an engineer, but as far as the general policy goes, this is an area that is getting a lot of attention right now. They've had a few bumps, and I hope that we're learning from those things. And I think that this will be an area that will eventually bear some fruit.
Okay, so what I would tell you is that directed energy has been around a while. I can remember as a young lieutenant, so this is a long time ago, before many of the audience were probably born. I can recall a major coming into our unit. I was a young lieutenant who had just spent his last 3 years working on directed energy, and that was in early 1980s. So obviously this has been around a while. We've used different types from chemical to energy, lasers. And there's all sorts of types of capability that now we're realizing that greater precision, and of course, all the increased computer power that we have, that we can now build systems. And of course, as we get closer to things like next generation networks, we can connect them better, and in flight, or I should say, can detect, have detection to the effector that maybe direct energy is the basic capability of that system to hit not just sensors, which tend to move slower, be they in the air as platforms, or even ground-based and fixed, or could be mobile, but not going to move very fast. The real issue is directed energy against hypersonic systems, and in this particular case. What we're starting to see is that it's certainly effective against air targets, slow to fast, but not yet hyper fast. That said, once you can have a sensor system that can provide the right kind of feedback to the directed energy shooter, so to speak, then we'll solve that problem. That's where work is ongoing. It's connecting the sensor to that shooter, so that you're not blasting directed energy through the airspace and space, and hitting who knows what else if in the area. You can predict exactly when it needs to be turned on or amplified for lethal or non-lethal kill capabilities.
Yeah. Jeffrey, I just want to say one thing in general, just overarching. You mentioned technology in general. And I think that almost everybody recognizes that we are at a point where we have got to start making some really hard choices. And there was a Future of Defense report that the House Armed Services Committee put out last month, and they talk about how we've got to divest the legacy platforms. We've got to put more money in technology, but nobody wants to agree upon what are those legacy platforms that we're going to get rid of so that we can start funding the technology that everybody knows that we need. And I think it's really important, very expensive to do testing on this kind of stuff and to do research and to just, for private companies to have the facilities for this kind of stuff and then to get, contracts to work on it. And how long should the contracts go on until they decide that it's worth it or not worth it? There's just such enormous financial and other resource investments in these things. And so it is going to be a serious discussion about what is the technology that we're going to bet on, and what are we. Directed energy is one of those things that we are at a serious point where there is general recognition. But again, like Skip was talking about in his presentation, you've got to deal with perspectives. You've got to deal with people who are going to, even these members of Congress that are forthright in saying we've got to, get rid of some, of these platforms. They don't want to in their district, So it's really, it's a hard conversation, but I think it's going to be a conversation that it has to be had, simply for budget reasons, but also for the real national security implications.
So this brings me to the question of Paulina Rios. She asks, to what extent should we be concerned about destabilizing dangers of cyber attacks on missile systems if we consider the vulnerability of non-space-based communication systems? Skip, Melanie?
Okay, so we talked a little bit earlier, and Melanie did to a degree. I think you did as well in terms of the kill chain that we try to disrupt in terms of our adversaries' capabilities, and of course protect and secure from our own allies or national capabilities. So we're trying to reinforce and make more resilient the blue kill chain, so to speak, and then disrupt or degrade the red kill chain. Cyber is a very effective tool for many reasons, and if you can look at the weapon system, at the pre-launch, in transit, and then near impact phases. Okay, and they're called different things depending on, you're talking about ballistic missiles or rockets and cruise missiles. But nonetheless, that's the weapon system, and there are some vulnerabilities because all of them have to have some type of tracking, positioning, timing, a system in flight to ensure that they can get those, and certainly those that are mobile also have to have some type of communications in flight to make sure that it's moving to the right direction. Very few, the older system can fire and forget, but that's not how they're built nowadays. But that's not the entire system. You've got some type of initial identification and guidance system when it's trying to track a mobile target, and you certainly have a C2 layer. And in many cases, in the defense aspect, you've got a radar, or sensor that's tracking the incoming. So there's a lot of different areas that are vulnerable to cyber degradation, interference. That not necessarily through a land-based or even satellite communications, but also through other elements of the electromagnetic system. So there are a lot of potential vulnerabilities in offensive and defensive systems, and so we've got to protect our own systems, ensure we have redundant means, of ensuring that position, navigation, and tracking of the weapon systems, but also the receipt of information and then the processing for the fire control, and then we look at the how we can influence adversaries. It's real; they're very, very tough problem sets, but I would tell you that they're certainly in the U.S. side, a lot of effort and special programs focused on that, and there are some cracks in the armor that can be exploited from our adversaries. That's about as far as I can go on this particular discussion. The Allies kind of rely right now on some of the most sophisticated nations with this kind of cyber offensive tools that can infect the kill chain, so to speak, as I mentioned. It's not prevalent, and we're probably talking about a handful plus of allies with different levels of tools that can be employed in this kill chain, degradation, disruption aspect, or protection. So hope that answers.
Definitely does. We've got an anonymous question on, and the question is, next to new IAMD related capability improvements, what diplomatic efforts does NATO undertake to reduce missile related risks? For example, the NATO London Summit commitment to strengthen arms control.
So both individual allies and the alliance, writ large, are very interested in arms control, disarmament, as well as non-proliferation. And I think in the case of there are efforts in all three. So the allies are very interested in what the U.S. does, with its key competitors. Read Russia, certainly in North Korea, China, and in Iran. So in most cases, what the alliance is interested is having a common voice and it's exerting diplomatic pressure to achieve the common aim. They've agreed with the U.S. In terms of arms control, disarmament, and proliferation, and frankly, also ensuring that NATO retains the conventional but also nuclear capabilities necessary to ensure that it has effective deterrence against potential adversaries that might want to employ missiles, long-range missiles, both conventional, but more importantly, nuclear capable. So NATO, although there are significant global efforts to ban nuclear treaties, as most people are aware of the most recent passage of the 50th ally or 50th nation state in the globe for banning nuclear weapons. NATO's going to be a part of that because they recognize that we've got to retain the capability for deterrence. But that said, non-proliferation of nuclear capabilities and missile capabilities is important to the alliance, and they come up with common positions that are propagated by nations individually, diplomatically, or when NATO engages certain other nations, and certainly try to demonstrate common positions in global or other organizations. Think OECD, Council of Europe, United Nations, where those discussions come up. So it's a common topic for the allies. Allies are very interested in knowing where New START's going, where the what might follow the INF Treaty, in a future U.S. administration. The kinds of discussions that U.S., as I said, had with North Korea, and then bring in, China to perhaps at some future point. And so, in the START type of negotiations to limit intercontinental and frankly, in expanding the types of negotiations we have to include those intermediate range capabilities and other types of nuclear capable weapon systems, not just intercontinental ballistic missiles. So I'll stop there.
Okay, great. So let's go into hypersonic missiles, because we've got a lot of questions from the audience in regards to this. Let's start with, let's have a broad question for both of you. You've heard in the introduction that we've got a statement that it says it can revolutionize warfare. In your opinion, do you think hypersonic weapons really have the ability to revolutionize warfare? Because we've also seen that, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the US, they're looking for hypersonic missiles, but using, for example, conventional warheads, while Russia and China are looking at integrating it with a nuclear-armed hypersonic weapon system. Skip.
Okay, you want me to take a start, Melanie? And okay, so I'll just say a few words and pass, and maybe come back for a second round. I would say that I'm not sure I would say hypersonic weapons will revolutionize warfare, but they are going to have a significant, impact on how we conduct warfare. But it's not the only technology that's going to have a significant impact. I think that equally revolutionary is going to be our leveraging a digital next generation network that can, and then the capabilities to integrate our weapon systems, both manned and much greater number of unmanned or autonomous types of systems that will have a greater impact on how we conduct warfare than just hypersonics. I think hypersonics is a significant tool. It's an asymmetric answer right now to the problem that Melanie was talking about, the increased air defense capabilities against existing cruise and ballistic missiles. So it's going to have to be addressed. It will be complex to address, lots of investment, as Melanie pointed out, and we're enthusiastic about where the U.S. is going, because the U.S. will always lead in, generally in technology and alliance. And so, allies are watching what the U.S. does and want to join them. But so my big answer, my bottom line is, it won't be the biggest, change that we will see in warfare. There'll be other collection of technologies and new applications that will have more of a revolutionary effect.
I agree with that. In my view, it's not that we're just going to use hypersonics all by themselves and it's going to change everything so much. We're not going to use them in the thousands or anything, but we'll use them as part of a structured attack, as part of complex and integrated attack with a lot of other things. We might hit very time sensitive or high value targets with hypersonic weapons in a certain scenario, and then follow it up with subsonics and bombers and things like that. But I don't think that it's the hypersonic missiles themselves that are going to be revolutionary as much as it might be how we figure out intelligence, the machine learning and things like that, that will have a greater impact on all sorts of different kinds of weapons.
And just to further build on that, Melanie, we've got for missile defense, we have always relied on the role of deterrent. With hypersonic threat or hypersonic technology maturing at a faster pace now, can we still rely on deterrence if the hypersonic threat is fairly difficult? It's an asymmetric kind of route, a potential game changer. Is the deterrence still relevant?
Of course, deterrence is still relevant. I mean, the problem isn't so much the dilemma is going to be for the United States not understanding if something coming towards us is nuclear capable, right? Because with Russia and China, they could be putting nuclear warheads on their hypersonic delivery systems. The United States is not doing that. But I think that deterrence is still possible. This is, important. The most important thing, especially if we can have a good defense on hypersonic defense, is, we want to make sure that our adversaries know that it will cost them if they, try to launch an attack against us, and that the cost is too high to start, or if we have to, there's deterrence by punishment, not just deterrence by no. So, again, we don't want to go down that road, and I, have all the same concerns that so many people do. But I think that deterrence is still really an important part of this, and that hypersonics contribute to it and don't detract from it.
So if I could just follow on that, what Melody just said, because that's the critical parts that I would highlight and reemphasize is, deterrence is not just deterrence by denial. In other words, deny an adversary the ability to achieve some objective. It could be limited, a single strike, and then therefore that's probably the best type of deterrence, because then they're not going to even embark on that that adventure. But deterrence by punishment is not, lesser effective, especially if you've got you can guarantee you're going to come back at them. In the age of the nuclear missiles, that was the survival second strike or third, fourth, fifth, and having those inventories and capabilities, triad for the U.S. But that's not the issue here with hypersonics. There will eventually be some effective defense, but we've got counter air. We've got decisive long-range precision strike capabilities. Now, if we add hypersonic to that, that ensures the likelihood of survivability of that weapon system. But frankly, there are plenty of existing systems that can ensure that deep precision strike. And our fifth generation, manned and unmanned platforms are a start, and are certainly a very significant start to reliably putting adversaries at risk. So we already have the deterrence by punishment, I think, in our current inventories and concepts.
We have now a question from Ronald Terrazas, which talks about hypersonic missiles, especially with speed reaction. Melanie, you've discussed about one of the best defensive measures is having very, very good early warning and intelligence, which plays a very important role. But with the hypersonic threat, Ronald has asked, using a Mach 20 missile, you could attack a country 2,000 kilometers away in 5 minutes. Say, for example, Beijing towards Taiwan. Which chance would neighboring countries have? What would be the chance that neighboring countries would have to defend themselves? Would these hypersonic missiles become the new big deterrent asset, like the new nuclear bombs were during the Cold War?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in all of this, the important thing is that you have a credible deterrent. And, it is true that instead of having 15 minutes or so, you might have 4 or 5 minutes. And this is a real problem because, especially when you look at what China could do to our allies in the Indo-Pacific, or what Russia could do to our allies in NATO, you could take out an airfield, or you could take out a base in just a couple of minutes before you could even get the planes moved. So this is a real problem that we have to think about. And again, is the credible deterrent that we would strike back? In that kind of a case, it might be. And so you want to be able to have that option, and you want to make it clear, because I'm speaking as an American, but as a part of NATO, that we would, defend our allies and that we would come together. But we have to make it clear that we would do that, in order that we would impose some kind of a cost.
Because Melanie, you're talking about a lot about the budget in the past. This is just a very open question, and for me, it's pretty difficult to answer even for myself. But we all know that missile defense systems are highly complex systems of systems, and we got also even with legacy systems, and we're trying to upgrade them, which is also fairly challenging. But is it possible in the future, because it has a global problem, it has to have also a global strategic approach? You can see the South China Sea, where various different actors can escalate it with horrible consequences. But is it possible to have an affordable and interoperable missile defense systems in the future to increase our global safety?
Okay, I'm going to leave the interoperability to Skip, but we would like to have that. As he said, we'd even like it amongst the services in the United States. There's so much disagreement there, and lack of communication. But it has been said by all of the defense leaders that we want to have hypersonic weapons, and we want to have them at a lower cost. We want to have them at scale. This is something that we are pushing for right now. And you can think about it, fine, it would be expensive to launch a hypersonic weapon, but what would the cost be to not have to not be able to protect something that was very valuable to us also? So you have to think of it in terms of that. But I do think, look, we can do hard things, and I'm just going to say it's been a little chaotic the last few years at the Department of Defense, and there's been, not the steady leadership that we might have wished to have seen. Okay. And I am confident that, Congress wants this. Republicans and Democrats are on board with this. I'm confident Congress wants it. The new administration doesn't want to have a failure, and they see where technology is heading, and they see what Russia and China are doing. And even just for political purposes, they don't want to have some kind of a failure. They don't want to appear to be soft here. If I'm going back to perspective, and if industry can feel like there's the steady leadership and that they're going to have a steady program and capability to have a program from start to finish, there will be that investment. People want to help. People want to solve this problem. So many people in industry, big and small. This is something that people see as being impressive and interesting, and something that needs to be resolved.
So if I could add to Melanie's enthusiasm, which I completely share, okay, this is not an insurmountable problem. If we got a man in the moon in the 60s, I think we can do this now. And we're not starting from scratch. And probably most importantly, when you talk about budget, we're already seeing some of the outlines of cost-effective solutions. We have some, we in this case is more US, but the US has long-range, low-altitude sensors, which are effective in large numbers, and they have been, globally deployed, but they've tested and started to field a system. And so that's going to allow us on the sensor start, okay? We know we can solve the integration aspect with applied efforts, connect both current and legacy systems with some future ones, as we can get there. It just takes time and concerted effort. And of course, that's work between both, the industry and government with rights incentives to integration. And we're building integration into future systems, as I talked about before. And then in terms of the kinds of effectors, can we get long-range effectors against hypersonics? Well, we're first working on the cruise missile, sub-hypersonic, but still very, very fast and maneuverable. And that's being worked right now. And there are some capabilities that exist. And then, most recently, with the indirect fire system, I think I forgot, I missed, there's a P, effective fire protection system, IFPS, I think it's called. It's been tested now several times in the US, where you're just using howitzers against hyperspeed cruise missiles, not necessarily hypersonic, but fast cruise missile targets. And of course, that's using multiple bullets from very cheap weapon systems, respectively, to the missile. And you could think of cluster type munitions, or not clusters, that's the right word, but fragmentary systems allow for much broader coverage over a base, so you don't have to get the missile jets at its tip or body. You can put it in the area where it's likely to run into. The old small arms air defense concept. Lots of bullets in the air to get something going through that cloud, and that's cost effective. So we've got the outlines of some solutions right now, and we're going to get better over time.
Building on that, Skip. In recent news, we have got in October 2020, 10 NATO countries launched an initiative concerning ground-based air defense, the GPAD capabilities. What sort of challenges do you foresee for national technologies needing to be integrated into a multinational GBAT?
Particular program is meant to start from a common set of objectives. So one major objective is we're going to build a system that can fire different types of effectors, from very short range to medium range, so it can cover troops right in a particular area to much farther out, and then also so it can counter a series of air types of air breathers, piloted and unpiloted, unmanned things, but also missiles. And then it will have a common C2 backbone. So the way you get after the problem is you have a common goal. So we're going to design this type of system, and there might be some existing programs that can be reoriented or adapted to meet this requirement the nations have come together on, or something designed brand new. And so it's going to be a modular approach where we'll look at what might be offered right now that can be adapted and that nations can buy into, or what might need to be developed over time to achieve the objectives. The first thing is a common objective on which we're trying to reach with interoperability, integration as part of the design, and then following through with not just the political will. We had the political will because the defense ministers signed up to it. It's now putting the money where that will is and following through with the program. And I think we have already delivered on a whole series of multinational programs. And so, we've got a historical success record. And as long as we continue to build on that success record, then, I think we're going to deliver just what the allies have signed up to. Now, I hope you'll take another shot with me with my eyes open and mouth shut. But thank you very much.
I wanted to get all of us. I thought this is a good Thanksgiving day, right?
We have a next question here from Martin Blesha for Melanie. You described 3 types of hypersonic missiles, HGVs, HCMs, and the third type. In the third category, you put Kinzhal and the DF-17. However, the D-17 is often tagged HGV. Could you please elaborate on this more?
My understanding is that it is maneuverable in re-entry. So I would put it in that third category of aeroballistics. Am I incorrect on that?
I don't have any further information of this person, so I wasn't too sure.
All right.
But, that was your response, so we'll keep it at that.
Okay.
And let's skip a few.
No, I was going to say it's important to distinguish between maneuverable and non-maneuverable, and that's an additional challenge that I was talking about before, and this is where in some cases allies may say, okay, well, if it's going to be really difficult to catch that darn thing in transit because it can go left, right, up, down instead of just straight to. That complicates the entire field of sensing and trajectory prediction, and so that makes it very difficult. It doesn't eliminate the near-in capabilities, because once a hypersonic glide vehicle is closing in on its target, it can't maneuver at that speeds close to its target. Right. If at some point it's dedicated to its trajectory for the desired point of impact. And so close in defense, this is like the very short range or short range, can still be effective. And it's just a matter of ensuring that our targeting and effector systems can guide that effector to where the hypersonic trajectory is at the speed it's going.
We're going to do the final questions because we've got almost just 12 minutes, but like say 10 minutes remaining to close the event. And I'll make this, if you could do it a bit shorter, the answers. Apologies for that. One of our, an anonymous person has asked the question, given the short reaction times coming with hypersonic systems, should or will the mutually assured destruction policy be updated? And should a potential nuclear strike be assessed by a human or probably a faster automatic or AI system? And, yeah.
We've lost Skip, it looks like. So I cannot really speak to the second. I will just say, as far as the first goes, I've almost lost your question. I will say that I think there will be a reconsideration of nuclear doctrine under with the Biden administration. I don't know that anything is going to actually change. They will. Elizabeth Warren and other members of Congress. Oh, you wanted this short, but I will say they have introduced legislation such as no first use and so on, which wouldn't directly affect American hypersonic weapons, but it would affect nuclear policy in general.
And further building on that. As you're dealing with a lot with policy, Do hypersonic missiles induce an imbalance or an asymmetry in international defense relations, or do they rather constitute a transformation on all relevant sides? Melanie?
I was going to see if Skip wanted to take that one. If he heard the
Yeah.
question, I'm not sure.
No, all I heard was relevant sites. So
Okay,
that gives
let me repeat
a
the
wide
question.
range.
So the question is, do hypersonic missiles induce a new imbalance or asymmetry in international defense relations, or do they rather constitute a on all relevant sides?
So do you want to start that with Melanie? I can.
Oh, no, go ahead. I was going to kind of refer back to what I had said earlier. I don't really have much else to say about that. So go ahead.
Okay, so what I would say is obviously it's going to make a difference on which nations we're talking about, in what adversarial relation we're talking about. So in the case of allies, that there may be a whole lot of allies who aren't going to have the either hypersonic or the defense against hypersonic weapons or the offensive capability, and they're going to rely on those allies that do have that. But because we have our Article 5 clause, in fact we have in Article 2 and 3 that also have relevant you can come in to support an ally regardless of whether or not it's considered a defense against all by the alliance. So the point being is that if we've got sufficient capability within the alliance, I think the allies are going to be fine with that. And of course, they've come up with a system to equitably, share the defense burden. And when you got 30 allies, there's a lot of smaller nations, probably at least about 18 of them that we consider small and would have the capability to have a suite of defensive and offensive capabilities against hypersonics, or including hypersonic technology. So yes, it will change the relationship between specific alliance helps respond to that. And so in the U.S. big picture, with North Korea, Japan, Australia, Philippines, etc., they've got alliance or key relationships here for defense, and that will help offset the challenges that will pose in the Indo-Pacific region. So it's not just a nation discussion here. It's a nation alliance, and the good news is the U.S., all the allies, have got a bunch of allies, and so that's the good news in terms of this particular capability.
My final question to both of you, to both Melanie and Skip. People imagine missile defense will kill missile interception from, say, a ground-based vehicle. They have they feel secure what NATO provides them, an umbrella kind of security, but they have never seen actually missile defense in action. So there's perhaps a false sense of security. So for young professionals, the main question for you would be, why should people care about missile defense? Why is it important now?
In some respects, it's never been more important because there's more countries have more missiles, and there seems to be more instability and more aggression in certain neighborhoods in the world. And in my view, it's really, we really need to take this seriously. And this is something not just that because there's aggression going on, but because missile defense has been proven. It has aged well, let's say. The technology has and so it's something that has proved itself worthy of defense and confidence and more study.
Skip.
So I think I would agree completely with what Melanie just said. I think the most important thing that we have to understand is that hypersonic technology, like missile technology in general, is proliferating. It's easier to access the technology. That means smaller, rogue or bully nations can threaten neighbors and sometimes even big neighbors with the capabilities. And if we don't spend the amount of effort needed in research and development and fielding of counter capabilities or capabilities that can offset and threaten those, then we are putting our citizens and our territories at risk. And so, if we want to deter, we have to demonstrate the capability to defend and ideally deny the objectives of adversaries, and then we can save the money of having to actually defend ourselves and the reconstruction after aftermath of a conflict. So deterrence is cheaper. That's why it's important to invest in.
All right, so we have to end it here. I would like to share a few announcements. If you enjoyed the live stream, please like and subscribe. And I would like to kindly ask you if you could also complete the survey provided in the description box below, as it will help us create better events for you. I would like to thank Melanie and Skip for joining us at YPFP. And this is Jeffrey Hoevenagel signing out from YPFP. Thank you for attending YPFP's live stream. We would like to kindly ask you if you can provide your feedback on the event through the following QR code or accompanying link, which is also provided in the description box below.